There's something about the wilderness that pulls us in, the promise of freedom, adventure, and breathtaking views. But out there, far from the safety of civilization, the rules are different. The trails hide secrets, the woods hold whispers, and sometimes, you don't come back the same. Tonight, we're bringing you 3 terrifying tales of hikes gone horribly wrong. Stories of fear, survival, and mysteries that will keep you out of the woods for good. So grab your flashlight, stay on the trail, and don't look back, because these stories will make you think twice before your next hike. If you love chilling tales that leave you speechless, hit that subscribe button and join us, because you won't want to miss what happens next. Imagine waking up early for a peaceful sunrise hike, expecting nothing but fresh air and breathtaking views. But what if, halfway through the trail, something feels off? What if the timeline of your journey doesn't add up? In today's story, we follow Jessica, an experienced hiker, who sets out on a solo adventure in Yosemite only to discover a chilling gap in her memory and GPS data. What happened during those missing hours? Stick around as we unravel this unsettling and baffling real-life event that will leave you questioning reality. I've always found a certain calm in the rhythm of my feet hitting the dirt trail. It's a feeling that's hard to replicate anywhere else. That morning, Yosemite greeted me with its usual grandeur. Tall trees swaying gently, the faint chirping of birds, and a cool breeze brushing my face. I had chosen the Mist Trail, a popular but demanding hike, to challenge myself and soak in the beauty of Vernal and Nevada Falls. My plan was simple: start at sunrise to avoid the crowds and push myself to make it to the summit before noon. I parked at the trailhead around 5:45 a.m., checked my gear, and set off by 6 a.m. sharp. My GPS tracker was turned on, my phone tucked safely in my backpack, and my headlamp secured in case the early morning light wasn't enough. The first half-mile was uneventful. The trail wound upward, the sound of rushing water from the Merced River growing louder as I approached the lower falls. Everything felt right: my breathing, my pace, even the slight chill in the air. I passed a few early risers heading back down the trail, their nods of acknowledgement adding to the sense of camaraderie that hikers often share. But somewhere near the first steep incline, I began to notice something odd. My body felt off, not in a dramatic way, just a subtle discomfort that I couldn't place. My legs moved fine, my breathing was steady, but it was as if I was walking on autopilot, like my mind wasn't entirely present. I brushed it off as lack of caffeine, or maybe nerves about tackling the more strenuous parts of the trail. Still, it lingered in the back of my mind. By the time I reached the first set of granite steps leading to Vernal Fall, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden hue over the misty waters. It was breathtaking. I paused to take a photo, though something about my hand felt unsteady as I held my phone. Shaking my head, I told myself to focus. I tightened the straps on my backpack and pushed forward. The climb became steeper and the trail narrowed. My body felt heavier with each step, as though an invisible weight had been added to my pack. I'd hiked this trail before, so I knew what to expect, but this time it felt different. My usual bursts of energy didn't come. Instead, I found myself pausing more frequently than usual, even though my fitness level hadn't changed. By the time I reached the bridge that offers the first clear view of Vernal Fall, I decided to check the time. Pulling out my phone, I saw that it was 6:25 a.m. That didn't make sense. The climb to this point should have taken at least 45 minutes, maybe more given my slower pace. Yet here I was less than 30 minutes in. I frowned, double-checking my phone's clock and my GPS tracker. Both confirmed the same timeline. Maybe I'm just moving faster than I thought, I muttered to myself, though it felt unlikely. Still, I pushed the thought aside and continued. The trail past Vernal Fall grew more challenging, the granite steps becoming uneven and slick from the mist. I focused on my footing, determined not to slip. The unease I felt earlier had faded somewhat, replaced by the usual adrenaline that comes with tackling a steep climb. The sound of the falls faded as I climbed higher, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the crunch of gravel underfoot. The trail became less crowded, the solitude allowing me to lose myself in thought. But then something else struck me as odd. The sun's position in the sky seemed wrong. It was higher than I expected for the time. By the time I reached the summit, it felt like I had been hiking for hours. My legs burned, my throat was parched, and my mind craved the satisfaction of knowing I'd completed the climb. I pulled out my phone to check the time again, expecting it to be around 9 a.m. Instead, it read 6:30 a.m. My heart skipped a beat. That couldn't be right. I checked my GPS tracker, and while it showed my location at the summit, the recorded time matched my phone. Somehow, the 2-hour hike had taken me only 30 minutes. I tried to piece it together logically. Maybe I misread the time when I started. Maybe my phone's clock was off. But the unease crept back in stronger this time. I sat down on a nearby rock, pulling out a granola bar to steady my nerves. I told myself it didn't matter how long it took. I was here, and that was what counted. Still, the nagging feeling wouldn't leave. I decided to check the missed calls and messages on my phone. To my surprise, there were several, all from my family. The first one came in at 6:15 a.m., asking if I'd reached the trailhead safely. Then another at 6:30 a.m., then 7 a.m. They sounded increasingly worried, even though I had no memory of their calls or notifications. "Hey, just checking in," one voicemail from my dad said. "We're getting worried. Call us when you can." How could I have missed these? I hadn't taken my phone off airplane mode until I reached the summit, and yet the timestamps didn't match my timeline. It didn't add up. I decided not to linger at the summit. Something felt off, and I wanted to get back to the trailhead as soon as possible. On the way down, I double-checked my surroundings, trying to spot anything I might have missed on the way up. Everything looked normal. The same trees, the same granite steps, the same mist from the falls. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial had escaped my notice. When I finally made it back to my car, I checked my GPS tracker again. There was a gap of nearly 2 hours, completely unaccounted for. The tracking line resumed at the summit as though I had teleported there. I stared at the screen, my mind racing with possibilities. Had I blacked out? Zoned out so completely that I lost track of time? I started the drive home, still grappling with the missing hour. As soon as I had service, I called my dad to let him know I was okay. He sounded relieved but confused. "Jessica, we were so worried. You weren't responding, and your GPS showed you off the trail for a while. What happened?" I didn't have an answer for him. Even now, I'm not sure I ever will. Sometimes, the scariest stories aren't about the things we can't explain, but the ones that feel all too real. A family's peaceful camping trip takes a chilling turn, unraveling piece by piece until it's clear they're not alone. What starts as an escape into nature ends with questions they'll never find answers to. Buckle up. This is a journey you won't forget. It had been years since we'd gone camping. Between work, the kids' school schedules, and life's endless responsibilities, we hardly had time to breathe, let alone escape to the wilderness. But this time was different. My husband, Alex, insisted. "We need this," he said, and he wasn't wrong. We chose a spot near Sedona, tucked deep into the woods but not too far from civilization. The campgrounds were quiet for a weekend, just a few scattered campers setting up their tents or RVs. The forest was beautiful, the kind that reminded me of childhood summers spent in nature. Towering pines, soft needles underfoot, and the kind of air that felt clean, untouched. The first night was perfect. After we set up the tent, we built a fire and roasted marshmallows with our 2 kids, Ethan and Sophie. Their laughter echoed as they chased each other around the clearing, their flashlight beams cutting through the twilight. As the night deepened, we settled in. The forest around us buzzed with life. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It felt alive, comforting. Alex and I stayed up a little longer after the kids went to sleep, sharing a bottle of wine under the stars. If this doesn't reset us, I don't know what will, he said, smiling. I nodded, feeling a rare sense of peace. The change happened gradually. I woke up sometime around midnight to use the bathroom. Crawling out of the tent, I immediately noticed the absence of sound. The forest, so vibrant hours earlier, was completely silent. Not a cricket, not an owl, nothing. I stood there, my flashlight scanning the trees. "Alex?" I whispered, unsure why I felt so uneasy. He stirred inside the tent. "What's wrong?" "Do you hear that?" He poked his head out, squinting at me. "I don't hear anything." "Exactly." He laughed softly. "You're imagining things. Go back to bed." But I couldn't shake the feeling. Something about the stillness felt wrong. I finished up quickly and slipped back into the tent, trying to convince myself that it was just my nerves. The next morning, I almost forgot about it. The forest was back to its lively self, and the kids were excited to explore a nearby stream. We spent the day hiking and playing by the water. The sunlight filtering through the trees made everything feel warm and safe. But by the time evening rolled around, the unease returned. Alex and I were gathering firewood while the kids played near the campsite. That's when I noticed it, carved into the bark of a nearby tree. A strange symbol, almost like a circle with lines radiating out from the center. "Look at this," I called Alex over. He frowned, tracing the carving with his fingers. Probably just someone messing around. But it didn't feel random. There was something deliberate about it. As we walked back, I noticed more markings on other trees, all similar but not identical. I didn't say anything to Alex, not wanting to worry him, or myself. That night, the silence returned, earlier this time. The kids were asleep, and Alex and I sat by the fire. He was scrolling through his phone, trying to get a signal, while I stared into the flames. "Do you think it's weird?" I asked finally. "What?" "The quiet, the carvings." He shrugged. "We're in the middle of the woods. It's probably just nature doing its thing." But nature didn't carve symbols into trees. It was Sophie who heard it first. The next evening, as we were getting ready to settle in, she tugged on my sleeve. "Mom, I heard someone." I froze. "Someone? Where?" "Over there." She pointed toward the woods. "They said my name." My stomach dropped. Alex looked up from where he was stoking the fire. "What's going on?" "Sophie thinks she heard someone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He stood, shining his flashlight into the trees. "Hello," he called out. His voice echoed, but there was no response. "It's probably just your imagination," he told Sophie, ruffling her hair. She didn't look convinced, and honestly, neither was I. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, I heard it too. A faint voice, just beyond the firelight. It sounded distant, like someone calling out, but I couldn't make out the words. "Did you hear that?" I asked Alex, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly. "Stay here." He grabbed the flashlight and ventured a few steps into the woods. I wanted to call him back, but the words caught in my throat. When he returned, his face was pale. "There's no one out there," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. The next morning, we decided to pack up. The kids were on edge and Alex and I had barely slept. As we were loading the car, Ethan pointed at something near the edge of the campsite. A circle of rocks, perfectly arranged with ashes in the center. "Did you make that?" he asked. I shook my head, feeling a chill run down my spine. It hadn't been there the day before. We didn't stick around to find out who, or what had. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. The campsite looked peaceful, ordinary, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been watched the whole time. The forest thinned as we drove toward the main road, but the tension in the car remained thick. Sophie and Ethan sat silently in the back, their faces pressed against the windows as they stared at the trees. Alex kept both hands tightly on the wheel, his jaw set in a way that told me he was more shaken than he wanted to admit. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, hoping for a signal. Nothing. It wasn't until we were about 20 minutes out that I finally saw a bar of reception pop up. "I'll check the map," I said, more to fill the silence than anything. Alex nodded, his eyes fixed on the road. As I pulled up the GPS, something caught my attention. There was a red dot on the map, a pin marking our exact location, but none of us had placed it there. "Did you?" I started to ask Alex, but stopped myself. It could have been a glitch. I deleted the pin and went back to the map. That's when I noticed the road we were on wasn't showing up anymore. Instead of the familiar highway I'd seen earlier, the screen displayed a blank stretch of gray. "We're not on the map," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "What do you mean?" Alex asked, glancing over. It's not showing the road." He frowned. "Maybe the app's acting up?" I tried to shake it off, but something about the way the GPS refused to update made me uneasy. As we rounded a bend, we spotted a car pulled over on the side of the road. A man stood beside it, waving a flashlight in slow arcs. "Do we stop?" Alex asked, his grip tightening on the wheel. I hesitated. Normally, I'd say yes. What if he needed help? But after the last few days, my instinct screamed at me to keep going. "Let's just drive past," I said. Alex nodded, speeding up slightly as we approached the car. The man turned to face us, his flashlight illuminating his face for a brief moment. I caught a glimpse of something that made my stomach lurch. He wasn't looking at our car. He was looking directly at me. His eyes didn't waver as we passed, and for a split second, I thought he smiled. "What was that?" Alex asked, his voice uneasy. I shook my head. "I don't know. Just keep driving." We decided to stop for the night at a small roadside motel. The kids were exhausted, and I couldn't bear the thought of driving any farther. The motel was the kind you only see in old movies. Neon sign buzzing, a lone clerk behind the counter. The woman who checked us and didn't ask many questions, handing us a single key with a faint smile. The room was clean but sparse, with 2 double beds and a small TV bolted to the wall. Alex and the kids fell asleep quickly, but I couldn't. I kept replaying everything in my mind. The silence, the carvings, the voice Sophie heard, the man on the road. None of it made sense, but it all felt connected somehow. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to a faint knocking sound. I sat up, my heart racing. The sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't at the door, it was at the window. I reached over and shook Alex awake. "There's someone outside." He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "What?" "Listen." The knocking came again, and Alex immediately tensed. He got up slowly, grabbing the flashlight from the bedside table. "Stay here," he whispered. He pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside, then froze. "What is it?" I hissed. He didn't answer right away, just let the curtain drop and turn back to me. "There's no one there." We left early the next morning, not even bothering to check out. The kids were quiet again, sensing the tension between us. It wasn't until we got back home that I noticed something strange. As I unpacked our bags, I found a small rock tucked into one of the kids' backpacks. It was smooth, polished, and unmistakably part of the circle we'd seen near the campsite. "Ethan," I called, "did you take this?" He came into the room and looked at the rock, confused. "No, I didn't touch anything." I believed him, but then how had it gotten there? That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't left the campsite behind, that somehow it had followed us home. a remote trail deep in the Rockies, a campsite abandoned without a trace, and a journal filled with unsettling confessions. What began as a peaceful hike quickly turned into a mystery that has haunted him ever since. This isn't just another story. It's a chilling real-life account that leaves more questions than answers. Step by step, we'll take you through the most unnerving 2 days of his life. You won't believe how it ends. My name is Jason Miller, and I've been hiking the Rocky Mountains for over a decade. Nature has always been my escape, a place to clear my head and reconnect with myself. But there's one hike I'll never forget, one that still makes my hands tremble when I think about it. It started on a late October morning. The air was crisp, the sky cloudless, and the trails relatively empty. I had planned a 2-day hike along a less-traveled path near Indian Peaks Wilderness. It was a trail I'd heard about from locals, described as serene but challenging due to its remoteness. I packed light, a tent, food, water, and my trusted notebook for jotting down observations. The first day went smoothly. The trail was stunning, with golden aspens giving way to dense pine forests. By mid-afternoon, I found a small clearing beside a stream and set up camp. The sound of running water was comforting as I cooked my dinner and scribbled notes about the day. That night, under a blanket of stars, I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, after a quick breakfast, I continued uphill. The trail narrowed, the terrain growing steeper. Around noon, I reached a ridge that offered a breathtaking view of the valley below. As I stood there, I noticed something odd on the other side of the ridge, a wisp of smoke rising in the distance. It wasn't unusual to see signs of other hikers, even on remote trails, but the smoke was faint, as though the fire had been left unattended. Curious, I decided to investigate. After descending into the next valley and cutting through the brush, I came upon the campsite. It was eerily quiet. The campsite looked like something out of a catalog, perfectly nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by towering evergreens. A faded blue tent sat in the middle, its flap open. A pair of scuffed hiking boots were neatly placed just outside, and the remnants of a small fire pit smoldered faintly, wisps of smoke curling into the air. "Hello," I called out, stepping closer. No response. I scanned the area. The fire had been abandoned recently, probably within the last hour. A canteen rested against a nearby rock, half full. A lightweight jacket was draped over a log by the fire. Whoever had been here couldn't have gone far, but there was no sign of movement in any direction. I felt an odd twinge in my gut. Something wasn't right. The campsite looked lived in, but it lacked the usual signs of activity. No trail of footprints, no sign of a struggle or panic. Just an eerie stillness, as though time had paused the moment I arrived. Still, I convinced myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe they'd gone off to collect water or explore the area. But as I looked closer, I began to notice small, unsettling details. The food scattered near the fire pit was half-eaten, left as though someone had abandoned their meal mid-bite. A plastic fork lay bent on the ground, snapped in half. That's when I saw the journal. It was sitting on a rock next to the tent, its black leather cover worn and scratched. The pages were thick, the edges frayed, and the clasp was undone, as if it had been hastily thrown aside. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. The journal felt heavy in my hands, its leather rough against my skin. I flipped it open, hesitating for a moment. I wasn't one to pry into someone else's life, but the eerie quietness of the campsite compelled me. I needed to understand what had happened here. The handwriting was neat at first, the entries dated and detailed. The writer was someone named Daniel, a solo hiker documenting his journey through the Rockies. The first few pages were mundane, descriptions of the trails, the wildlife, and the solitude of hiking alone. But as I turned the pages, the tone began to shift. Day 4. Saw another hiker today. Didn't talk to him, but it was a relief to see someone out here. This trail is lonelier than I expected. Day 6. Noticed my food supply is lower than it should be. I'm certain I packed enough for 10 days, but somehow it's disappearing. Maybe I miscalculated. Day 7. Found footprints near my camp this morning. Thought it was the guy I saw earlier, but these prints are odd. They're too big, and they don't match any boot pattern I've ever seen. Could be a bear, but they look human. My stomach tightened as I read. The entries became shorter, the handwriting messier, as though written in haste. Day 9. I feel like I'm being watched. Every night, it's the same, waking up to sounds I can't explain. No animals, no wind, just movement. I stopped reading and glanced around the campsite. The stillness now felt oppressive, as if the trees themselves were leaning in to watch me. I took a deep breath and forced myself to keep reading. Day 10. Decided to pack up early and move fast. Can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. I don't know if it's paranoia or if someone's out here with me, but I'm not sticking around to find out. The final entry wasn't dated. The handwriting was jagged, almost illegible, the ink smudged as though written in a rush. If someone finds this, I didn't imagine it. They're out here. I can't outrun them. I shut the journal, my heart pounding. The air felt heavier now, the quietness of the woods almost deafening. I scanned the campsite again, looking for anything, anyone, that could explain what I just read. That's when I saw it. About 20 feet from the tent, partially obscured by the underbrush, was a trail of deep impressions in the dirt. They weren't ordinary footprints. They were large, uneven, and spaced far apart, as though something, or someone, had been moving through the forest at an unnatural pace. I stared at the impressions in the dirt, my breath catching in my throat. They didn't look like anything I'd seen before, too large for a human, but lacking the defined shape of an animal print. The spacing was strange, as if whatever made them had an unsteady gait. I told myself to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and walk back to my camp, but something kept me rooted in place. A morbid curiosity, or maybe a foolish sense of responsibility to piece together what had happened to Daniel. I followed the trail. The impressions led deeper into the forest, weaving through the trees in a way that made my skin crawl. The underbrush was trampled, branches broken at odd angles. Whatever had passed through here wasn't trying to hide its movements. About 50 yards from the campsite, the trail ended abruptly in a small clearing. The ground was disturbed, dirt kicked up as though there'd been a struggle. In the middle of it all lay Daniel's backpack. The straps were torn, the fabric ripped open, and its contents spilled out: clothing, a map, a first aid kit. But no sign of Daniel. I knelt to inspect the pack, my pulse hammering in my ears. That's when I noticed the stains. Dark streaks of what looked like dried blood marked the edges of the torn straps. I stood up quickly, my legs trembling. The forest around me seemed darker now, the light filtering through the canopy, casting strange shadows on the ground. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the trees themselves were watching. I turned to leave, retracing my steps back toward the campsite. But as I moved, I became aware of something else, a faint sound in the distance. It wasn't footsteps or rustling leaves. It was subtle, rhythmic, almost mechanical, like something brushing against tree bark at intervals. I froze, straining to pinpoint the direction. Nothing. The sound stopped. I pushed forward, faster now, my heart pounding with each step. When I reached the campsite again, it looked exactly as I'd left it. Empty, untouched, except for the journal still sitting on the rock. I grabbed it and stuffed it into my pack, not daring to look around. I didn't bother breaking down the site. I left my tent, my gear, and started the trek back to the trailhead. The sense of being watched never left me, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. When I finally reached the parking lot hours later, the relief was overwhelming. I tossed my pack into the back of my car and collapsed into the driver's seat. But as I started the engine, something caught my eye. Across the lot, near the edge of the tree line, was a single figure, tall still and completely motionless. too far to make out details, but close enough to feel its presence. I didn't wait. I threw the car into drive and peeled out of the lot, the figure shrinking in my rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely. I reported what I'd found to the rangers the next day, handing over Daniel's journal and describing the campsite. They assured me they'd investigate. A week later, they called me back. "We checked the area," the ranger said. "No sign of any campsite, and no journal either. Are you sure about the location?" I hung up without answering. I knew what I'd seen. To this day, I can't explain what happened to Daniel, or who, or what I saw in the parking lot, but I haven't set foot on that trail since, and I never will.